"I didn't flee. I merely hid from the lie." These were the final words written by a former Nazi colonel who lived hidden for nearly 60 years in an alpine cave, next to a Mercedes-Benz and over 100 journals detailing his dark past. When his mummified body was accidentally discovered by scientists in 2024, the world uncovered one of the most disturbing secrets of the post-war era. And what came to light afterward, no one was prepared to face. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The smell of burning paper filled Colonel Klaus Richter's office. Outside, Berlin was falling apart. Russian artillery pounded the eastern districts, and American planes darkened the sky. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was crumbling after just 12. Through his cracked window, he could see black smoke rising from the Reichstag and hear distant tanks getting closer. Inside his office, though, everything was still in perfect order. His boots shined like mirrors, his uniform was pressed despite the water shortages, and maps hung neatly on walls that would soon belong to the enemy. Klaus Richter lived by discipline. It had carried him from the mud of the Great War, through officer training, and up through Hitler's army. At 52, his hair had turned silver at the temples, but he still stood straight as a pole, and his blue eyes could make young officers stutter when he looked at them. On his desk lay 3 items: a leather map book with red lines drawn through the Alps, a set of fake papers for Karl Reiter, supposedly a cattle farmer from Innsbruck, and a key to a storage building on the edge of the city. Next to these sat his gun, the Walther P-38 that had been with him from Poland to Russia and back to Germany. Behind him, a grandfather clock ticked steadily, counting down the minutes. In exactly 47 minutes, he would start the most important mission of his life, his own disappearance. Richter had watched others run away, some to Argentina with stolen gold, others to Spain under the church's protection. But those were desperate men making panic choices. Richter was different. His decision to vanish wasn't made in panic, but calculated over many months as he watched the inevitable collapse. He had prepared carefully, the hidden alpine cave he remembered from childhood holidays, supplies hidden over the past year, and gold taken from operations in the East. Unlike the others, he wouldn't run across oceans. He would simply cease to exist, becoming a ghost in the very country that had created him. He checked his watch, German engineering that would soon be rare, and locked away his personal items. As the time approached, he put on his coat, tucked the documents into his inner pocket, and holstered his gun. With one last look at the office that had been his domain, he switched off the light and closed the door. Colonel Klaus Richter stepped into the corridor, not like a man running away, but like someone starting a mission from which there would be no return. In the garage below waited his escape vehicle, a commandeered Mercedes-Benz 770K, armored and fueled, ready to carry him into history or out of it. The massive engine of the Mercedes roared to life as Richter turned the key, its deep rumble echoing off the concrete walls of the underground garage. This was no ordinary staff car. It was Hermann Göring's personal vehicle, taken during the chaos of Berlin's final days. Its armor could stop most bullets. Its fuel tanks were full, and most importantly, its trunk held 3 wooden boxes, one of canned food, one of ammunition and supplies, and one filled with gold bars, each marked with the Reichseagle. As he drove the luxury car up the ramp and into the apocalyptic landscape of Berlin, Richter calculated the odds. He needed to travel about 600 kilometers through territory that would soon be full of Allied forces. A journey that in peacetime would take a day, but now might need weeks of careful navigation. Berlin had become hell on earth. Buildings stood like blackened teeth against the red sky. Streets were filled with rubble and abandoned vehicles, and the few people still outside moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed and desperate. Richter avoided main streets, instead guiding the Mercedes through a maze of side roads and alleys he had memorized for this escape. Twice he had to stop as Soviet patrols passed nearby, and once he drove around a firefight between SS diehards and advancing Russian troops. The heavy car proved its worth when he had to push through a pile of debris, the reinforced bumper clearing a path where other vehicles would have been stuck. By nightfall, Richter had reached the western outskirts of the city, progress, but hardly safety. He drove without headlights, guided only by occasional breaks in the clouds that allowed moonlight to show the bomb-cratered roads. Every checkpoint was a gamble. Sometimes he presented himself as a military courier on final orders. Other times, he claimed to be moving medical supplies. His officer's uniform and commanding manner still earned respect from the scattered German units he met, while the few Allied patrols he spotted were avoided with careful timing and local knowledge. The colonel allowed himself no rest, no food beyond a few bites of hard bread, and no moment of weakness. Each kilometer between himself and Berlin improved his chances. Dawn found him deep in the Bavarian countryside, the Mercedes hidden under a camouflage tarp in a dense forest, while Richter consulted his maps. He had made better time than expected, benefiting from the confusion of the collapsing front lines. Here he made his first transformation, changing from his distinctive colonel's uniform into the simple clothes of a Bavarian farmer. Complete with a worn hat and sturdy walking boots, the uniform went into a special waterproof container, to be preserved rather than thrown away. He would need it again, not for authority, but for memory. Only his pistol remained from his military identity, now hidden in the folds of his civilian coat. Karl Reiter was born, as Klaus Richter temporarily died. The journey continued with new caution. Richter avoided towns and villages, taking winding country roads that added miles but reduced risk. He passed columns of defeated German soldiers walking home and convoys of triumphant American GIs. Each encounter tested his nerve and his cover story. When questioned, he spoke perfect Bavarian dialect, claiming to be returning to his family farm after losing a leg to frostbite on the Eastern Front, a story supported by a convincing limp he had practiced for months. By the third day, the landscape began to change, the gentle hills giving way to the first dramatic rises of the Alps. Richter felt something close to relief as the mountains came into view. They represented not just his destination, but a natural fortress where armies had always struggled to maintain control, the perfect place for a man to disappear. The ascent into the Tyrolean Alps tested both man and machine. The Mercedes, designed for the smooth streets of Berlin rather than rugged mountain tracks, protested as Richter coaxed it up increasingly steep and narrow paths. 3 times he had to clear fallen rocks with his bare hands, and once the car nearly slid backward into a ravine before he managed to stabilize it with stones wedged behind the wheels. Richter's childhood memories of these mountains had guided his initial planning, but 40 years had changed the landscape. Logging had thinned some forests, while others had grown thicker, and certain paths had disappeared completely. Yet his methodical approach prevailed. At each junction, he checked both his maps and the position of the sun, keeping his bearings with military precision. After a week of dangerous climbing, Richter finally reached the hidden valley he remembered from a boyhood hunting trip with his father. Nestled between 3 towering peaks, accessible only by a single winding path that could be easily watched, it offered the isolation he needed. More importantly, along the valley's northern wall lay the cave entrance, a dark opening nearly invisible among the fallen boulders unless one knew exactly where to look. With the last of the Mercedes fuel, he maneuvered the vehicle as close to the cave as possible, then spent 2 exhausting days building a crude ramp of logs and stones to move the car inside. Each gold bar, each box of supplies had to be carried separately into the depths, a tiring task that left even his fit body aching with fatigue. The cave itself exceeded his expectations. Beyond the narrow entrance, it opened into a series of chambers, The first large enough to hold the Mercedes with room to spare. The second forming a natural storage area where water dripped from stalactites into a small pool of surprisingly clean water. And a third, deeper chamber that would serve as his living quarters. The temperature stayed constant year-round, cool but not freezing, and the rock walls provided insulation from both weather and detection. Most important was the chimney-like shaft at the back of the third chamber that allowed smoke to disperse through a network of natural vents, making it possible to maintain a small fire without revealing his position with visible smoke. Richter approached the creation of his hideout with the same attention to detail that had marked his military operations. He built a bed frame from pine branches, covered with the Mercedes leather back seat for comfort. He organized his supplies with mathematical precision, calculating exactly how many calories he would need per day, and planning accordingly. The gold was divided into small portions and hidden in various spots throughout the cave system, ensuring that even if part of his sanctuary was discovered, his resources wouldn't be entirely lost. From the car's toolkit, he made crude but effective cooking tools and modified the battery to power a single electric lamp for several months before it would need to be recharged, using a hand-cranked mechanism he designed. As June turned to July, Richter established the rhythms and routines that would define his new existence. Each morning began with exercises, jumping jacks, push-ups, and stretches to maintain his strength. Then came a careful inventory of supplies, followed by necessary maintenance tasks. Afternoons were spent exploring the surrounding area, memorizing every tree, stream, and rock formation within a 5-kilometer radius, and setting subtle markers that would warn him of intruders. Evenings were devoted to planning and reflection. It was during these quiet hours that he began the first of his journals, not as confession, but as declaration. A record for posterity that would ensure his version of history survived even if he did not. "I have not retreated," he wrote on the first page. "I have advanced to a position from which the true battle can be fought, the battle for historical truth." In the isolation of the cave, with only the echo of his pen on paper for company, Klaus Richter began his self-imposed exile, not with resignation, but with grim determination. The first winter revealed the limits of even the most careful planning. By November, Richter's carefully rationed supplies began to dwindle faster than anticipated. The caloric demands of keeping warm in the alpine winter exceeded his calculations. Game was scarce at these heights, and venturing too far from his sanctuary risked exposure. Each trip outside became a strategic operation, with risks weighed against necessities. During one such expedition, while setting traps for rabbits near the tree line, he spotted a column of smoke rising from a small clearing 2 valleys away. Through his binoculars, he observed a solitary figure tending a primitive farm, a man approximately his own age, with the weathered face and stooped posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in these mountains. Johann Steiner had the suspicious nature of all mountain people, particularly in these uncertain times when strangers often meant danger. When Richter first approached the isolated farm, Steiner met him with a shotgun and eyes that held decades of distrust. Their initial conversation was a careful dance of half-truths, Richter presenting himself as Karl Reiter, a war veteran seeking solitude after losing everything in the bombing of Munich. Something in his demeanor must have resonated with the old farmer, who had himself fought in the previous war and recognized a soldier's bearing. No mention of politics passed between them, no discussions of ideology or loyalty. Instead, their conversation focused on practical matters, the harshness of winter, the challenges of mountain survival, the techniques for preserving meat without salt. Their arrangement evolved naturally, born of mutual need rather than trust. Steiner had food but lacked medicine for his chronic lung condition, a legacy of gas attacks in the trenches of Verdun. Richter had medical supplies salvaged from military kits, but needed sustainable food sources. Their first exchange was simple, a vial of morphine for a sack of potatoes and dried venison. Over the following weeks, the transactions continued with unspoken rules. Meetings always occurred at the halfway point between their respective territories. Conversations remained limited to necessities, and neither man asked questions about the other's past or future. When American patrols began appearing in the valleys below, conducting sweeps for high-ranking Nazi officials believed to be hiding in the region, Steiner provided warnings without commentary. By the spring of 1946, their pragmatic alliance had settled into rhythm. Once every 2 weeks, weather permitting, they need meet at the lightning-struck oak that marked the boundary between their domains. Richter always brought something of value: gold coins from his dwindling supply, precision tools salvaged from the Mercedes, or occasionally antibiotics that made Steiner's persistent cough more bearable. In return, the farmer provided essentials: flour ground from his small wheat field, eggs from his chickens, occasionally meat when hunting had been good. More valuable than these, however, was the information Steiner casually shared: news from the valleys below, rumors of Allied movements, gossip from the distant village where he sometimes traded. What Richter could never determine was whether Steiner genuinely believed his cover story or simply chose to accept it. The farmer never questioned when Richter's knowledge of military matters seemed too detailed for a civilian, never commented when a word or phrase suggested education beyond that of a simple Munich shopkeeper. When, during the winter of 1946, American soldiers came directly to Steiner's farm asking if he had seen any strangers in the area, the farmer reported the incident to Richter with the same emotionless efficiency he might use to describe weather changes. "They showed me photographs," he said, placing a bundle of turnips on the ground between them. "One looked like you, but I told them I see only goats and wolves up here." Neither man acknowledged the implications of this statement. Instead, Richter handed over 2 gold coins, twice the usual payment, and they parted ways in silence. The transaction complete, the unspoken contract honored. In the moral wasteland of post-war Europe, such arrangements were perhaps the closest thing to friendship that either man could afford. By 1947, the initial chaos of post-war Europe had given way to a new order, one that made Richter's continued existence increasingly precarious. The Allies, particularly the Americans, had transitioned from haphazard sweeps to methodical manhunts for Nazi officials. Operation Paperclip extracted scientists, Nuremberg tried the leadership, and 1,000 lesser tribunals processed the rank and file. Even in the remote Alpine valleys, change arrived. Roads were improved, tourism slowly resumed, and the isolation that had protected Richter began to erode. The colonel responded by further restricting his already limited movements. The radius of his safe territory, once 5 kilometers from the cave, contracted to barely 2. Even his meetings with Steiner became less frequent, occurring under cover of darkness and with elaborate precautions that the pragmatic farmer tolerated but clearly found excessive. The most dangerous moment came in the spring of 1948, when an American patrol unexpectedly established a temporary base less than a kilometer from the cave entrance. For 6 agonizing days, Richter remained in the deepest chamber, rationing his breathing to minimize sound, sleeping in short bursts, and gripping his Walther when footsteps echoed from the outer passages. On the 3rd day, 2 soldiers actually entered the front chamber, their flashlight beams sweeping the walls as they commented on the unusual rock formations. They passed within meters of the carefully concealed Mercedes without noticing the tarp-covered shape, and left without venturing deeper. After their departure, Richter spent weeks improving his camouflage techniques and establishing additional escape routes through secondary cave passages he had previously ignored. Within his shrinking physical world, Richter's mental landscape expanded through his journals. What began as sporadic entries evolved into a daily ritual, with each notebook filled in precise architectural handwriting that betrayed no hint of the increasing isolation affecting its author. The early volumes focused on military analyses, detached assessments of battles he had commanded, strategic evaluations of where the Wehrmacht had succeeded or failed, and technical critiques of weaponry. By 1950, however, the content began to shift. Political justifications appeared with increasing frequency, along with lengthy digressions on historical precedent and the inevitable conflict between Germany and Russia. Names of places and people gave way to abstract concepts: blood, soil, destiny, betrayal. Throughout it all, however, one pattern remained constant. Richter positioned himself not as participant, but as observer, a professional soldier merely fulfilling his duty amid forces beyond his control. The deterioration of the Mercedes became symbolic of Richter's changing circumstances. Initially maintained with fanatical care, its chrome polished weekly, engine components cleaned and preserved, the vehicle gradually transformed from escape mechanism to relic. The battery died despite his best efforts at recharging, the tires slowly deflated, and leather seats cracked despite applications of precious oil. Yet Richter could not bring himself to dismantle it, instead preserving it as a museum piece, occasionally sitting in the driver's seat during particularly difficult nights, hands on the wheel, as if he might somehow drive away from his self-imposed prison. The car represented not just mobility, but connection to his former identity, a physical reminder of who Klaus Richter had been before he became a ghost. By 1955, a decade into his exile, Richter had established patterns so deeply ingrained they approached religious ritual. Every morning began with the same sequence of exercises, followed by equipment maintenance, followed by exactly 45 minutes of writing. Food was consumed at precisely the same hours each day, regardless of hunger. His uniform was removed from its waterproof container once monthly, inspected for damage, then carefully returned to storage. These routines served a dual purpose, maintaining his sanity through structure while reinforcing his military identity. Yet subtle changes revealed the psychological toll of isolation. Conversations with Steiner, once terse and practical, occasionally extended into philosophical territory. More disturbing were the one-sided dialogues Richter began conducting with his absent commanding officers, justifying decisions made years earlier to superiors long since executed or imprisoned. "You would have done the same, General," he wrote in his 27th journal. "When the Russians came through our lines at Kursk, what choice remained but to execute the saboteurs? Orders must be followed, particularly in retreat." Whether these represented genuine moral questioning or simply the mind's need for human interaction remained unclear, perhaps even to Richter himself. By the late 1950s, Richter's journals had evolved from personal records into an elaborate ideological fortress. Notebook after notebook, filled with increasingly dense and systematic defenses of his actions during the war, meticulously categorized and cross-referenced as if preparing for a tribunal that would never come. He developed a complex coding system with colored inks indicating different categories of justification: blue for military necessity, red for following superior orders, green for actions taken to protect German civilians. In Volume 34, he began translating key sections into Latin, a language he had studied in his youth, creating an additional layer of security, or perhaps imposing intellectual distance between himself and the most troubling memories. These Latin passages, rendered in flawless classical grammar, focused primarily on operations in Ukraine and Belarus, regions where his command had intersected with Einsatzgruppen activities. Richter's relationship with history shifted during this period. Rather than simply recording his perspective, he began actively engaging with news that filtered through Steiner, who now occasionally brought newspapers along with supplies. When reports emerged about the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, Richter devoted an entire notebook to refuting the legal basis of the proceedings, citing obscure provisions of international law and historical precedents dating back to the 30 Years' War. When the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials began in 1963, his writing became feverish, with margins filled with exclamation points and underlined passages. They judge with the luxury of retrospect, he wrote, comfortable in their moral certainty while ignoring the realities of command during total war. Would they have chosen differently, these coffeehouse philosophers who never saw a city burn or heard the Katyusha rockets screaming overhead? This period also marked a significant evolution in Richter's perception of his isolation. What began as a tactical retreat, a temporary measure until the political climate changed, gradually transformed in his writing into a noble sacrifice. He began referring to his cave as the Eagle's Watch and to himself as the Guardian, casting his exile not as hiding, but as a form of resistance. I remain here not in fear, but in defiance, he wrote in 1962, preserving the unvarnished truth while the victors rewrite history according to their needs. Someone must remain untainted by their influence. Someone must maintain the record. The contradiction inherent in this position, a man simultaneously hiding from justice while claiming to stand for truth, never appeared to register in his increasingly elaborate self-narrative. The practical aspects of survival continued alongside this intellectual fortification. Through Steiner, Richter learned basic techniques for preserving alpine plants with medicinal properties, reducing his dependence on dwindling pharmaceutical supplies. He developed systems for collecting and filtering rainwater, cultivated edible fungi in the cave's humid interior chambers, and fashioned increasingly sophisticated traps for small game. The gold that initially facilitated his arrangement with Steiner was nearly exhausted by 1964, requiring a renegotiation of their exchange. The farmer, now well into his 70s and increasingly debilitated by his respiratory condition, agreed to continue their arrangement in return for Richter's German military medical kit and instruction in its use. Perhaps the closest the two men ever came to acknowledging the colonel's true identity. Richter's obsessive documentation extended beyond his journals during this decade. He began creating detailed maps of his surroundings, noting seasonal changes, animal migrations, and the gradually increasing human activity in the lower valleys. He maintained weather records of remarkable precision, using a barometer salvaged from the Mercedes dashboard. Most strangely, he commenced a photographic inventory of his possessions, using a camera obtained through Steiner and developing the images using chemicals mixed according to military field manual specifications. The resulting photographs, of his uniform laid out with ceremonial precision, of the Mercedes maintained despite its uselessness, of his living quarters arranged with barracks room neatness, were organized into albums with typed captions noting date, time, and significance. This catalog of exile, meticulously updated, served no practical purpose, but appeared to provide Richter with a sense of control over his diminishing world, a way of asserting order, even as his circumstances grew increasingly disordered. The isolation that Klaus Richter had mastered for 2 decades began to exact its psychological toll as he entered his 3rd decade of exile. The journals from this period reveal a significant shift in format, the military precision giving way to dialogue. Initially, these took the form of imagined debriefings, with Richter recording questions that might be asked by his former commanders, followed by detailed responses justifying his actions. By 1968, however, these evolved into more complex exchanges with figures from his past, fellow officers, subordinates, and eventually even civilian encounters briefly mentioned in earlier volumes. Captain Weber asks why I ordered the retreat from Kharkov without authorization, begins one entry. I explain again the situation. Soviet forces had broken through the northern perimeter. Fuel reserves were at critical levels, and holding position would have resulted in complete encirclement. Weber remains unconvinced, still believing we might have counterattacked if given reinforcements. He fails to understand that no reinforcements were coming. Berlin had already written us off. The most frequent phantom conversationalist in Richter's journals was a Lieutenant Müller, apparently a young officer who had served under his command on the Eastern Front. The Müller dialogues began in 1969 and occupied increasing portions of each notebook. eventually dominating entire volumes. What made these exchanges particularly notable was their adversarial nature. Mueller questioned Richter's decisions not from a strategic perspective, but from a moral one. Mueller asked about the village near Minsk today, reads an entry from 1970. Again with the village. I explained the partisan situation, the clear intelligence about weapons cached in the church, the sniper fire that had killed 3 of our men. Orders were orders. The reprisal was standard procedure. He listens but does not accept, this imaginary Mueller with his imaginary conscience, as if he wasn't there himself, as if his own hands remained clean. These dialogues represented the closest Richter came to self-recrimination, though always filtered through the literary device of an external questioner. The physical realities of aging and isolation presented new challenges. At 73, Richter's health began to decline despite his disciplined regimen. A particularly harsh winter in 1971 triggered respiratory problems that lingered for months, while declining eyesight made his meticulous journaling increasingly difficult. Most concerning was a fall in 1973 that left him with a badly sprained ankle, forcing him to crawl around his cave dwelling for weeks during recovery. The journals from this period include detailed inventories of physical ailments alongside matter-of-fact contingency plans for various medical emergencies. If appendicitis occurs, he noted clinically, self-surgery remains the only option. The procedure would require sterilization of the hunting knife, extraction without anesthesia, and cauterization using gunpowder. Survival probability estimated at less than 20%. These medical self-assessments, delivered with detached precision, stand in stark contrast to the increasingly fractured psychological content surrounding them. Johann Steiner's death in 1972 represented another significant rupture in Richter's carefully maintained existence. The elderly farmer succumbed to the lung condition that had plagued him since the First World War, leaving Richter without his sole human contact. For 3 months following Steiner's passing, Richter made no expeditions outside his cave, subsisting entirely on stored supplements. When he finally ventured out again, he discovered that Steiner's small farm had been inherited by a grandson who had little interest in maintaining the isolated property, visiting only occasionally to check on the livestock. After careful observation, Richter established a new pattern, raiding the farm's root cellar and chicken coop during the grandson's absences, leaving gold coins as payment, despite there being no one to acknowledge the exchange. These nighttime expeditions carried significantly higher risk of discovery than his arranged meetings with the elder Steiner had, but necessity overrode caution. By 1975, Richter's journals had undergone yet another transformation, incorporating what he termed strategic assessments of current global conditions. Working from fragments of information gleaned from occasional newspapers and infrequent radio broadcasts picked up on a crystal set he had constructed, the former colonel attempted to analyze Cold War developments with the same methodical approach he had once applied to battlefield situations. These analyses, impressive in their attempt at comprehensiveness despite severely limited information, reveal both his continued intellectual acuity and his increasingly anachronistic worldview. The Americans' withdrawal from Vietnam confirms what our High Command understood in 1944, he wrote. Democratic systems lack the will for sustained conflict, regardless of material advantage. The Soviet advance continues unchecked through proxy forces, while the West debates with itself. The inevitable confrontation approaches, exactly as the Führer predicted, though with different players on the German side of the equation. Interspersed with these geopolitical assessments were increasingly frequent conversations with his phantom lieutenant, now focusing not on past actions, but on the colonel's decision to remain hidden as the world transformed beyond his mountain sanctuary. The physical deterioration that began in the previous decade accelerated dramatically as Richter entered his late 70s. His once methodical handwriting grew increasingly erratic, with some journal entries trailing off mid-sentence when his hand cramped too severely to continue. A series of small strokes in 1977, documented with clinical detachment in his medical log, left him with a slight drag in his right leg and occasional difficulty finding words, particularly frustrating for a man whose internal world had become so dependent on precise language. Dental problems, addressed through crude self-extractions, limited his diet to increasingly soft foods. Most significantly, cataracts began clouding his vision, transforming his cave dwelling into a blur of shadows that required careful memorization of where every item was placed. These physical challenges were met with the same disciplined adaptation that had characterized his military career. But entries from this period reveal a new emotion previously absent from his writing: fear, not of capture, but of dying alone in darkness. The practical routines that structured Richter's existence adapted to his limitations. His foraging expeditions, once conducted with military precision, became increasingly risky as diminished eyesight and mobility made him more vulnerable to injury and detection. After a particularly dangerous incident in 1979, when he became disoriented in a sudden alpine fog and nearly wandered into a tourist hiking area, he further restricted his movements. The abandoned Steiner farm, now visited only a few times yearly by increasingly distant relations, became his primary supply source. These raids required careful timing and left him increasingly dependent on preserved rather than fresh foods, contributing to his deteriorating health. Most concerning was his dwindling supply of clean paper for his journals, which he addressed by developing an elaborate system for writing between existing lines using different colored inks, effectively doubling each notebook's capacity while rendering the text nearly indecipherable to anyone but himself. In stark contrast to his physical decline, Richter's ideological entrenchment intensified. The journals from 1980 forward reveal not just a defense of past actions, but a renewed conviction in their rightness. Entries from this period contain increasing references to vindication, often tied to contemporary events filtered through his limited information sources. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 prompted a flurry of writing about the inevitable conflict with Bolshevism that he had always foreseen, while economic challenges in the West were interpreted as confirmation of the inherent weaknesses in democratic systems. Perhaps most notably, the rise of historical revisionism regarding the Second World War, which he encountered in fragments through occasional newspapers, provoked his most vehement writing. "They now attempt to deny what we all witnessed," he wrote in 1982. "Soon they will claim none of it happened, not the bombing of Dresden, not the Soviet atrocities in East Prussia, not the starvation of German prisoners. My records may be the last uncontaminated testimony, written by one who saw with clear eyes before history was sanitized by the victors." The phantom conversations that had characterized the previous decade evolved into something more complex during these years. Lieutenant Mueller remained a frequent interlocutor, but he was joined by an expanding cast of spectral visitors. Some identifiable as historical figures like Field Marshal von Manstein or Albert Speer. Others apparently composites of people Richter had known. Most disturbing were dialogues with unnamed civilians from the Eastern Territories. Their questions left unanswered in the text, followed by pages of justification addressing unspecified accusations. "They do not understand the nature of war," he wrote after one such exchange in 1984. "Partisan actions required countermeasures. This was policy, not personal choice. One cannot apply peacetime morality to conditions of total conflict." These passages, often written in the middle of the night according to their timestamps, suggest periods of significant psychological distress, breaking through the carefully maintained facade of military rationality. By 1985, Richter had filled 117 notebooks, creating a paper fortress more elaborate than the physical one that contained his aging body. His world had contracted to its smallest dimensions, physically limited to the cave and its immediate surroundings, socially reduced to phantom dialogues, and temporally increasingly focused on the past rather than present or future. Yet one aspect of his discipline remained undiminished: his care for the Mercedes. Despite its deterioration and his own failing eyesight, he maintained a weekly regimen of cleaning and preserving the vehicle, running a cloth over its surfaces with ritualistic precision, occasionally sitting in the driver's seat to run his fingers over the controls he could no longer clearly see. In his journal, he justified this seemingly irrational devotion to an inoperable machine. "The car remains what I remain, a witness. When all else has been corrupted or forgotten, we will both testify to what was, not what they claim was." The man who had once commanded battalions now commanded only memories, but he maintained them with the same iron determination that had defined his military career, fighting a rearguard action against time itself. The final phase of Richter's exile represented the most profound physical challenge of his life. By his mid-80s, the combination of age, inadequate nutrition, and the cave's constant dampness had left him with severe arthritis and recurring respiratory infections. His mobility decreased dramatically, often confining him to the inner chamber for weeks at a time, particularly during the harsh alpine winters. Journal entries from this period frequently reference pain, the subject previously mentioned only in the most clinical terms, suggesting that even his legendary self-discipline had its limits. "The right hand barely functions this morning," reads an entry from 1987. "Each finger must be individually commanded to move, like reluctant soldiers questioning orders. Yet the record must continue. The record is all that remains." His writing, once architecturally precise, deteriorated into a spidery scrawl, with some passages rendered nearly illegible by tremors that the text itself methodically documents. Cognitive changes accompanied the physical decline. While Richter's military analytical capabilities remained remarkably intact, he could still recall battle formations from 40 years earlier with perfect clarity. His grasp on contemporary events became increasingly tenuous. Periods of disorientation appeared in the journals as unexplained gaps, sometimes spanning days, followed by entries that attempted to reconstruct the missing time with military precision. More concerning were episodes of temporal confusion, where entries suddenly referenced active military operations as if they were ongoing, only to abruptly return to present awareness in mid-paragraph. "Must reposition the 7th Panzer to counter the Soviet thrust near Kursk," begins one entry from 1992, continuing for several detailed paragraphs of tactical instructions before breaking off with, "But this is nonsense. Kursk was 1943. It is 1992. I am no longer in command of anything but these walls and this failing body." The outside world's dramatic transformations penetrated even Richter's isolation. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which he learned about months after the fact from a discarded newspaper found during one of his increasingly rare excursions, prompted an uncharacteristically emotional journal entry. "They say the wall has fallen. Berlin united again. They speak of a unified Germany on the horizon. Everything we fought for and against collapsed into new configurations I cannot fully comprehend from these fragments of news. Was it all for nothing then? The millions dead, the cities destroyed, the continent divided, all to return to borders not so different from before the war. History makes fools of us all, perhaps, even those of us who tried to preserve its truth." The dissolution of the Soviet Union 2 years later further shattered his Cold War framework, eliminating the enemy that had defined much of his military career and undermining the global conflict narrative that had structured his understanding of his own actions. As his physical world contracted to its smallest dimensions, Richter's internal landscape expanded in unexpected directions. His later journals contains something previously absent from his writing: poetry. Interspersed between tactical analyses and phantom conversations appeared verse composed in rigorous classical meters, primarily Sapphic and Alcaic stanzas, addressing themes of exile, duty, and mortality. Written primarily in German, but occasionally in Latin, these poems represent perhaps the most honest emotional expression in his entire documentary legacy. The eagle's bones grow hollow with years, his talons blunt against unyielding stone, yet memory of flight remains, when wings once cast shadows over armies, reads one fragment from 1994. This late-emerging lyricism suggests a psychological shift from the rigid self-justification that dominated his earlier writing towards something approaching reflection, though never quite reaching what could be called remorse. In January 2003, nearly 58 years after fleeing Berlin, Klaus Richter made his final journal entry. The handwriting, barely recognizable as the same that had filled the first notebook decades earlier, struggles across just half a page. The physician becomes his own patient, the commander his own final command. The Mercedes is prepared, the journals arranged, the uniform ready. Let those who find this place understand. I was a soldier. I followed orders. I survived when others did not. I preserved what others would destroy. I remained when others fled. Whatever judgment comes, I have outlasted my judges. History will find me here, waiting. Whether he anticipated death's arrival or simply recognized he lacked the strength to continue writing remains unclear. What followed was silence, the Mercedes becoming both throne and tomb as he apparently positioned himself in the driver's seat. Dressed in his preserved uniform, despite its looseness on his diminished frame, the 143 journals stacked neatly beside him. The final image is one of military precision maintained to the last, the ultimate act of control for a man whose life had been defined by it. The cave that had swallowed Klaus Richter whole might have kept its secret for another century were it not for the warming climate's effect on alpine glaciology. In the summer of 2024, a team of 3 researchers, Anna Bauer, a glaciologist, Thomas Weiss, a geological photographer, and Matthias Holzmann, a spelunking expert, were documenting the accelerated retreat of ice in the Tyrolean Range. Their primary focus was scientific, measuring the newly exposed rock faces to understand historical climate patterns. The cave entrance, previously obscured by year-round snowpack that had recently melted for the first time in decades, appeared as merely another data point in their survey, until Matthias's experienced eye noticed chisel marks around the opening, evidence of human modification. Curiosity piqued, the team decided to explore what they assumed was an abandoned mining tunnel or perhaps a military storage site from one of the world wars. The beam of Matthias's headlamp caught the gleam of polished metal first, an incongruous reflection that momentarily appeared supernatural in the absolute darkness of the cave. As the light steadied, the impossible took shape, a massive black Mercedes-Benz. Its once gleaming surface dulled by time, but unmistakably preserved, sitting like a mechanical specter in the cavern's center. Anna's scientific detachment momentarily faltered as her light revealed the driver's seat's occupant, a desiccated figure in a gray uniform, hands still positioned on the wheel, cat still perfectly angled on a skull where leathery skin stretched over prominent cheekbones. The cave's unique conditions, consistently cool temperatures, extremely low humidity, and minimal bacterial presence, had created a natural mummification effect, preserving not just documents but human remains in a state of eerie suspension between decay and preservation. The team's initial shock gave way to methodical documentation, their scientific training asserting itself even in the face of this macabre tableau. Thomas photographed everything with meticulous precision. The Mercedes from every angle, the stacked journals beside the passenger seat, the uniform with its insignia and decorations still recognizable despite the decades. Anna noted environmental readings, temperature, humidity, air composition that would help explain the remarkable preservation. Matthias, meanwhile, maintained a security perimeter, ensuring nothing was disturbed until proper authorities could be notified. Their whispered conversations, captured in Thomas's audio recordings, reveal the gradual recognition of Thing. "These aren't just any insignia," Anna murmured, peering at the uniform's collar. "This is Wehrmacht High Command, a colonel at minimum. And look at the date on this journal, 2003? That's impossible. He would have been hiding here for almost 60 years, Matthias finished, his voice hushed, with something between awe and horror. The discovery triggered an immediate and complex response from Austrian authorities. Within hours of the team's report, the cave was sealed by police, then quickly transferred to federal jurisdiction. A specialized historical crimes unit from Vienna arrived the following day, bringing forensic experts, military historians, and document preservation specialists. The site was treated with the methodical care of both a crime scene and an archaeological find. Every item cataloged, every surface examined for evidence. The body itself was removed with extraordinary precautions, transported to a secure facility in Vienna for examination and identification. The Mercedes, requiring specialized equipment for extraction without damage, remained temporarily in situ, documented exhaustively before plans for its removal could be finalized. Most challenging were the journals, their fragile pages requiring immediate stabilization before they could be moved, a process that took preservation experts working in the cave for nearly a week. News of the discovery leaked despite official attempts at containment, creating an immediate media sensation that transcended typical historical interest. International outlets descended on the nearest village, overwhelming the small tourist infrastructure as journalists sought angles on what was quickly dubbed the Alpine Nazi, or the Last Officer. Public reactions split along predictable lines. Academic institutions emphasized the historical significance. Jewish organizations demanded immediate investigation of war crimes. Right-wing groups questioned the authenticity, and conspiracy theorists spawned elaborate narratives about Nazi survival networks. Less expected was the reaction of Klaus Richter's remaining family, a niece and two grandnephews who had grown up believing their uncle died heroically on the Eastern Front in 1944, according to the official notification received by his sister. Their shock at discovering their relative had not only survived, but lived for decades as a fugitive was compounded by the sudden intense scrutiny of their family history, triggering a crisis of identity captured poignantly by documentary filmmakers who tracked them down within days of the announcement. The cave that had been Richter's sanctuary for nearly 6 decades became something entirely different in death. A crime scene, a museum piece, a media spectacle, and eventually a memorial. The Austrian government, initially hesitant about how to address the discovery, ultimately declared the site a protected historical location, not to honor Richter, but to preserve evidence of war crimes and their aftermath. The decision to eventually open a limited portion of the cave to researchers and educational groups came after months of heated debate about the ethics of display versus the importance of confronting historical atrocities directly. The compromise reached, allowing documented access while maintaining strict protocols against sensationalism, reflected Austria's complex relationship with its Nazi past, neither fully embracing accountability nor entirely avoiding it. Meanwhile, the journals that Richter had so meticulously maintained became the subject of intense scholarly focus, with a team of historians, psychologists, and ethics specialists assembled to determine how their contents should be handled, published, or potentially restricted. The man who spent decades believing history would vindicate him instead found his legacy becoming a case study in how nations confront their darkest chapters. Among the meticulously catalogued items recovered from Richter's cave sanctuary, one initially attracted little attention compared to the journals and military artifacts: a sealed envelope discovered in a hidden compartment beneath the Mercedes dashboard. Marked simply, "For Hans," in faded ink, it remained unopened during the initial documentation phase, classified as personal correspondence of unknown significance. It wasn't until Professor Heinrich Adler, the lead historian assigned to analyze Richter's journals, connected a cryptic reference in the 97th notebook. The boy would be 50 today. Does he still live in Munich? Does he know anything of his father's true history? That the envelope gained priority status. The discovery suggested something previously unknown. Klaus Richter, the man who had vanished into isolation, potentially had a son who might still be alive. Unaware of his father's survival and final fate, the search for Hans began with painstaking genealogical research. Richter's military records showed no indication of marriage or children, but a deeper investigation into Munich civil registries from the 1930s revealed a birth certificate for Hans Weber, born 1935, to single mother Elsa Weber. What connected this child to Richter was a separate document found in city financial records, a series of payments made to Elsa Weber from a private account belonging to Richter between 1935 and 1944, stopping precisely when he was reported killed in action. These payments, substantial but carefully structured to avoid attracting attention, strongly suggested a secret relationship and financial support for an illegitimate child. The pattern fit with Richter's methodical nature, acknowledging responsibility without risking his military career through public association with an unmarried mother during the socially conservative Nazi era. Finding Hans Weber after 80 years proved challenging but not impossible in an age of digital records and DNA databases. The search led first to Munich, then to Canada, where Hans had emigrated in 1960, according to German emigration records. At 89 years old, Hans Weber was living quietly in a Vancouver suburb, a retired engineering professor with 3 children and 7 grandchildren, his German origins evident only in a slight accent and a collection of Bavarian folk art displayed in his meticulously organized home. The approach to Hans required extraordinary sensitivity. An international team including a historian, a psychologist, and a representative from the Austrian government arranged a meeting, carefully preparing how to inform a man in his 9th decade that his father had not died heroically as he'd been told, but had instead lived for nearly 60 years as a fugitive from justice, possibly implicated in war crimes. Hans Weber's reaction defied all professional predictions. After listening silently to the carefully worded explanation, accompanied by authenticated photographs of the cave discovery, he responded not with shock or denial, but with quiet resignation. "I always suspected something wasn't right about his death," he told the astonished team. "My mother would sometimes cry looking at his photograph, but it wasn't like the other war widows. There was anger mixed with the grief." Hans revealed that his mother had told him little about his father beyond his military career and that he had died a hero. Only after her death in 1972 did Hans find a locked box containing letters from Richter, not from the front lines as expected, but dated months after his reported death, containing cryptic references to necessary disappearance and historical vindication. Hans had considered investigating, but ultimately decided against disrupting his established life and family with potential Nazi connections. "I chose to let sleeping dogs lie," he explained. "Perhaps I was a coward for not wanting to know." The sealed envelope, opened under controlled conditions with Hans Weber's permission and in his presence, contained 3 items: a letter dated January 2000, a small key, and a map marked with a precise Alpine location different from the cave where Richter had been found. The letter, written in the same meticulous hand as the journals, but showing signs of physical deterioration, began with a formal "To my son," and proceeded through 8 pages of complex justification, historical revisionism, and occasional expressions of regret, not for actions taken during the war, but for the absence from his son's life. The most telling passage came near the end. "I chose to preserve the truth rather than flee to Argentina or Brazil, as others did. Your father was not a coward who ran, but a soldier who held his position even when abandoned by history. The location marked will provide you with evidence of my service and the means to secure your future, should you require it." The map and key pointed to another alpine location, one that researchers quickly identified as falling within property that had once belonged to Johann Steiner's family before being sold to a development company in the early 2000s. The implication was clear. Richter had established a secondary cache, possibly containing the remaining gold from his original escape supply. The revelation of Hans Weber's existence and the potential second location transformed both the historical narrative and the ongoing investigation. Hans himself became central to the unfolding story, the living legacy of a man whose existence had been defined by disappearance. Media interest intensified despite efforts to protect his privacy, forcing Hans to grapple publicly with questions of inheritance, both genetic and moral. "I never knew this man," he told journalists during one carefully controlled interview. "I cannot take responsibility for his actions, but I cannot entirely escape them either. We all live with the ghosts of decisions made before we were born." Meanwhile, the search for the second location indicated in Richter's map began under strict governmental supervision, with archaeological specialists, historians, and even explosive experts participating due to uncertainty about what might be found. The story of Klaus Richter, which had seemed to reach its conclusion with his discovery, instead revealed itself as more complex than initially understood. Not just the tale of a man who disappeared, but of what and who he left behind. The secondary site indicated on Richter's map yielded discoveries that fundamentally altered the narrative surrounding his 60-year exile. Buried beneath what had become a small skiing equipment storage shed, investigators found a waterproof military container holding 3 distinct categories of items. First, gold bars and coins, the remnants of Richter's escape funds, substantial enough to support a comfortable life had he chosen to flee abroad rather than hide in isolation. Second, a collection of official Wehrmacht documents, orders signed by Richter himself, authorizing operations in Belarus and Ukraine that coincided with civilian massacres previously attributed solely to SS units. Most disturbing were the photographs, hundreds of them, meticulously labeled and dated, showing scenes from the Eastern Front, including several that clearly documented atrocities. Unlike the carefully curated journals with their elaborate justifications, these photographs presented raw evidence that contradicted Richter's written narrative of simply following orders and being uninvolved in ideological actions. The comprehensive analysis of Richter's journals, completed by an international team of historians in October 2024, revealed a psychological portrait far more complex than initial reports suggested. The team identified distinct phases in Richter's thinking over the decades, from the military pragmatism of early entries through periods of ideological entrenchment to moments of near confession buried within phantom dialogues. Professor Adler's final assessment captured the paradox at the core of Richter's exile. He created the most elaborate self-justification in recorded history while simultaneously preserving the very evidence that would condemn him. The man who claimed to be preserving historical truth was actively constructing a version of history that absolved him, yet he could not bring himself to destroy the photographs that contradicted his narrative. This suggests a mind at war with itself, seeking exoneration while compulsively preserving proof of guilt. Most telling was the timing of Richter's decision to create the secondary cache and write to his son, coming after decades of isolation had eroded his certainty, suggesting a man who finally understood that history's judgment would not align with his own. Hans Weber's response to his father's legacy evolved from initial shocked resignation toward active engagement with historical responsibility. After consulting with his children and grandchildren, he made several decisive choices that shaped the public understanding of Richter's story. First, he donated all recovered gold to organizations supporting Holocaust survivors and war crime victims, stating simply, this wealth was tainted by its origins and its purpose to help a war criminal escape justice. Second, he authorized the publication of selected journal excerpts alongside expert analysis, insisting that his father's self-justifications be contextually framed by historical facts. Most significantly, he agreed to participate in a documentary project that followed his journey to the cave where his father had lived and died, a pilgrimage captured with restraint and dignity that humanized the abstract questions of inherited guilt without minimizing the original crimes. I never knew this man, he reflected while standing in the cave's entrance. Yet his blood runs in my veins, and his choices have shaped my existence in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. We cannot choose our histories, but we can choose how we confront them. The Richter case triggered broader societal reckonings, particularly in Austria, where the discovery occurred. The country that had long positioned itself as Hitler's first victim, rather than an enthusiastic participant in Nazism, was forced to confront how its post-war narrative had created the very conditions that allowed Richter to remain hidden for decades. Local authorities near the discovery site acknowledged that rumors of a hermit in the mountains had circulated for years, but were dismissed as folklore rather than investigated. Records revealed that Johann Steiner had been questioned by Allied forces in 1947, but provided false information, raising uncomfortable questions about community complicity in sheltering war criminals. These revelations prompted national soul-searching and ultimately led to the establishment of a new historical commission tasked with examining post-war Austrian handling of Nazi officials, particularly in rural regions where denazification had been less thorough than in urban centers.